Noah Merritt never imagined that returning to the family ranch would come with more than memories and solitude. After 2 decades spent managing logistics for agricultural exports out of Houston, he'd grown tired of spreadsheets, airports, and shallow handshakes. The ranch had been in the Merritt family for over 70 years, a spread of semi-arid Texan land bordered by mesquite trees, old wire fences, and a dry creek bed that curved along the southern edge like a scar. It wasn't valuable in the modern sense. There were no minerals beneath it, no oil rigs nearby, no clean water source worth bottling. But it was home. It had weight. It grounded him. When his father died 2 years ago, leaving the land to Noah with only a brief, handwritten note tucked inside a dusty toolbox, Noah took it as a sign that it was time to stop living around the edges of his life. He left the city, sold his condo, packed up everything that still mattered and drove west until the buildings disappeared and the dirt turned red. He didn't come out here to reinvent himself or start some frontier fantasy. He came to maintain, to repair, to finish the things his father had started. The land wasn't pretty by commercial standards, but it was stubbornly alive. Cattle hadn't roamed it in a decade, but the brush was thick, the fence posts hadn't rotted, and the barn, though weathered, still held. Noah invested carefully, rebuilt the irrigation ditches, had the septic system redone, installed solar panels, replaced the old windmill, even submitted plans to build a small greenhouse. He kept to himself, paid his taxes, respected the boundaries, and took particular pride in not interfering with the neighboring parcels, many of which had since been subdivided and absorbed into residential zoning. It didn't affect him until it did. 6 months into his return, he received a letter. Not from the county. Not from the registrar's office. Not even from a neighbor. It came from a group calling themselves the Stone Hollow Development Committee. Noah didn't recognize the name. The letter was polite but laced with presumption. In accordance with upcoming regional water flow optimization projects, your parcel has been identified as a potential conduit zone for auxiliary runoff redistribution. The sentence had the bureaucratic ring of something intentionally designed to obfuscate. Attached was a rudimentary map with a shaded oval over the southwest corner of his land. His land, which he legally owned outright. The shaded section aligned almost exactly with the site of his father's defunct cattle pond. Long since dry, the basin now filled with reeds and scrub. Noah didn't panic. He called the number listed on the letter. A woman named Marlene answered, cheerful and clipped. She worked in community engagement, she said, and assured him this was merely a notification, not an enforcement. There would be a planning session in 2 weeks. His attendance was optional, but appreciated. Noah asked if any part of his land had been rezoned. She laughed, lightly, dismissively. "Oh, no, sir, nothing like that. This is a cooperative effort, voluntary, absolutely nothing binding." That same week, a pair of surveyors showed up unannounced. Noah found them walking along the fence line, GPS units in hand, muttering over a tablet. When he confronted them, they introduced themselves with vague authority, contracted civil engineers working under the regional drainage study. He asked who sent them. They responded vaguely as if they didn't quite know and claimed they were just gathering data. Noah told them to leave. One of them, a younger guy in steel-toed boots, muttered something about public interest and fluid topography, then walked back to the access road without further comment. Over the next month, small things began to shift. A new sign was posted near the access trail. Future site of Stone Hollow Community Pond Project. A vision for resilient water stewardship. It stood just beyond his boundary line but pointed directly toward the southwestern edge of his ranch. On the opposite side of the creek bed, stakes began appearing, neon flags flapping in the wind, each marked with coordinates. Noah started receiving glossy pamphlets about flood mitigation, printed in cheerful fonts and filled with photographs of artificial wetlands teeming with stock imagery of birds. One morning, a clipboard was zip-tied to his gate, listing permit suggestions and a friendly advisory from something called the Environmental Overlay Committee, a group he'd never heard of, whose website led only to a single landing page with broken links. Noah began digging through his deed records, land use reports, water rights filings, everything he could get from the county office. It was tedious but necessary. As far as he could tell, nothing had changed. His parcel was intact. The boundaries were unchanged. The supposed pond project was not sanctioned by the county's Floodplain Management Division. There were no formal permits submitted under the Regional Environmental Board. Whatever was happening wasn't official, or at least not yet. The tipping point came one Monday morning in late September. Noah was walking the line of his property, checking fence tension after a storm, when he heard the low rumble of machinery. Not the familiar chug of a distant tractor or harvester, but a deeper growl, mechanical and heavy. He followed the sound, moving south along the edge of the creek bed, and found them. 3 backhoes, 2 utility trucks, a temporary construction trailer parked just over the line. Men in reflective vests were unloading rebar and setting forms. One of the backhoes had already begun scraping the land in wide arcs, tearing at the hard soil like it was paper. Noah approached calmly, hands visible, posture firm. He asked for a supervisor. A man named Cole introduced himself, said they were contracted to begin earthworks as part of Phase 1. Noah asked for documentation. Cole produced a laminated printout of what looked like a subcontractor's work order, signed only with a letterhead from a firm Noah didn't recognize. The site plan included part of Noah's property. When Noah pointed that out, Cole shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with the people who gave us the go-ahead." It wasn't an accident. The equipment was positioned deliberately. Stakes had been driven into the ground with precision. The excavation had already broken through the upper crust of soil and was approaching a depth where any buried infrastructure would lie. Noah took out his phone and dialed the local county assessor's office. Not to argue, but to verify. The receptionist transferred him to a compliance officer who confirmed what he already suspected. That area isn't under any approved county project as of today. Noah asked carefully if any external agencies might have authorized it. There was a pause. Then, "Not to our knowledge." Noah left a voicemail with his attorney. He then contacted a local licensed surveyor, requesting an immediate site evaluation. Finally, he called his father's old friend, Ed Harmon, a retired contractor who had helped build the ranch's old infrastructure decades ago. Ed picked up on the third ring, and when Noah described what was happening, the line went quiet. Then Ed said something that chilled Noah more than any legal threat could have. "They shouldn't be digging there," Ed muttered. "That's where we rerouted the line back in '78. It wasn't supposed to stay active, but it was never decommissioned properly." Noah paused. "What line?" "The gas transmission," Ed replied. "There's a 30-inch pipe running right under that creek bed. You hit that thing at the wrong angle. Hell, even a hairline crack, and you're lighting the whole valley on fire." Noah didn't hesitate. He ended the call and drove straight back down the trail, tires kicking up clouds of dust, mind racing. His property was being excavated by unknown contractors with unclear authority. There was no posted permit, no legal right-of-way, and now there was the possibility, no, the certainty, of a live, pressurized gas line buried beneath the soil they were tearing through. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. Noah didn't return to the excavation site immediately. He spent the next 30 minutes pacing the interior of his house, calling every contact he could think of. He reached out to the regional branch of the state's gas utility, an entity that, while technically privatized, maintained maps of all transmission lines that passed through private land. The automated system bounced him from one department to another until he finally spoke to someone who understood the gravity of what he was describing. The woman on the other end took down coordinates, promised to escalate it internally, and warned him not to go near the area if he suspected an active, pressurized line. Noah knew what that meant. The implication wasn't casual. If they struck that pipe with a backhoe, the damage wouldn't be limited to a service interruption or leak. It would be a detonation. Less than an hour later, 2 unmarked utility trucks arrived near the access point. The men who stepped out wore flame-resistant coveralls, high-compression boots, and carried portable gas detectors. Noah approached one of them with the urgency of someone who knows time is no longer a luxury. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't shake hands. One of them simply asked, "You the landowner?" Noah nodded. The man motioned toward the direction of the machines. "Still active site?" Noah confirmed. They didn't say another word and made their way toward the excavation zone with measured steps, holding equipment like it might buzz at any second. Noah followed at a distance, staying outside the flagged markers. The closer they got, the more apparent it became that the workers had resumed digging. Another 10 feet of soil had been removed, and the sound of metal scraping against stone echoed in short bursts. One of the detector readings must have triggered because the taller utility worker raised his hand and shouted, "Stop all equipment!" His voice cut through the mechanical noise with such intensity that the backhoe operator immediately halted. A moment passed, then another. Noah watched as the workers looked between each other, confused but not panicked. Then the second utility worker knelt down, removed a small spade from his belt, and dug carefully. Within seconds, the blade of the spade hit something with a soft clink. He brushed the dirt away slowly, then looked up. His eyes met those of his partner, and without a word, the taller man reached for his radio. Code Amber. Confirmed exposure. Line is live. Repeat. Line is live. The construction crew started backing away. One man dropped his hard hat in the dirt. Another looked visibly shaken, rubbing his forehead with both hands. The supervisor, Cole, tried to approach the utility workers but was held back with a firm gesture. "This is now a restricted zone," the taller of the 2 men said, directing his words not just to Cole, but to everyone. "No further work is to continue until clearance is given by Federal Pipeline Safety." Cole opened his mouth to argue, but the utility worker didn't wait. He was already on the radio again, giving grid coordinates and referencing something called the GP2417 schematic. Noah stood just far enough away to not be involved, but close enough to feel the air shift. The mood changed like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. No one spoke to him directly. Not yet. He could see it on their faces. No one had expected this. Whatever plans the contractor had, whoever approved the dig, no one had taken into account the possibility that beneath this unassuming ranch land lay a dormant artery of volatile fuel. It wasn't the kind of thing you accidentally uncover, not unless someone had been lying about what was underneath. Over the next few hours, trucks came and went. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived but were quickly waved off by the utility team, who stated clearly that the area fell under the jurisdiction of federal infrastructure protection protocols. A man in a charcoal gray vehicle with no license plate tags arrived shortly after, stepped out in a crisp blue windbreaker bearing no insignia, and began taking photographs of the exposed pipe. Noah watched him from the fence line. The man never looked up, never acknowledged him. Just snapped photos, took notes, and made a call before vanishing down the dirt road again without speaking to anyone else. By early evening, temporary fencing had been erected around the dig site. Hazard tape crisscrossed the area, and the smell of raw earth mixed with the faint chemical sharpness of disturbed gas insulation. A small plaque had been staked into the dirt with the following words etched in all caps. Under Federal Review. No entry without permission. Section 19. 04. Compliance enforced. That was when Noah knew, without question, that this had surpassed anything the original developers had imagined. This wasn't just a conflict over drainage rights or land easements. Someone had ordered a dig without checking the Federal Infrastructure Registry. That wasn't just a mistake. It was criminal negligence. That night, Noah didn't sleep. He sat in his study with every document his father had ever stored, looking for any reference to the pipeline. He found it buried in an envelope marked 1949 Transfer Agreement, inside a faded letterhead from a company called Tri-River Natural Gas. The contents detailed an easement agreement that had supposedly expired in the mid-1980s, but had never been formally deactivated. No signature of cancellation. No follow-up. Just a quiet, lingering piece of dangerous infrastructure humming quietly beneath the soil for 40 years. The next morning, someone left an envelope in Noah's mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single page printed in block font, with no salutation or sign-off. We were assured your section was clear. This will be resolved quietly. Do not escalate. Noah read the note 3 times. Then he slid it into a folder labeled Correspondence Unknown. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't storm out or start calling media outlets. What he did was more measured, more precise. He scheduled an appointment with a federal land use attorney in the city and paid the deposit up front. He also began documenting everything: times, names, photos, not for drama, for evidence. By the end of that week, word had begun to spread. Not publicly, not in headlines, but through contractors who quietly canceled future work orders, through neighbors who noticed unfamiliar trucks coming and going at odd hours, through engineers who showed up with no company logo, surveyed silently, and left without so much as a clipboard in hand. Noah's attorney reached out to the Pipeline Safety Division of the Department of Transportation, which confirmed that the line in question was indeed active, part of an emergency bypass grid maintained as dormant infrastructure for potential future utility redistribution during high-demand scenarios. In layman's terms, the pipe was a last-resort flow backup, one no one had touched in years, but one that was still technically online. Noah wasn't surprised when he received a knock at his door late on Friday afternoon. It wasn't a sheriff, or a neighbor, or a lawyer. It was a woman dressed in casual slacks and a denim jacket, holding a folder under her arm and a badge clipped to her belt. She didn't introduce herself with a name, just a department: Federal Energy Security. "I'm not here to investigate you," she said plainly. "I'm here to document a misstep that could have ended with bodies on fire. You're not the target, Mr. Merritt. You're the witness." Noah nodded and stepped aside. She walked in like someone who didn't need permission. And somehow, he respected that. By the following Monday, the front gate to Noah Merritt's ranch had become a checkpoint. The previously familiar gravel path now bore tire tracks from government vehicles and surveyor rigs, some marked, others not. Temporary fencing surrounded the southwestern portion of the property, and a mobile containment trailer had been brought in, complete with its own generator and 2 watchmen who stood under the awning in windbreakers, sipping coffee and avoiding eye contact. No formal order had been issued to evacuate Noah or restrict him from his home, but the message was clear. This was no longer just his land, at least not in practice. Despite the federal tone of the situation, the silence from local authorities was deafening. Noah received no calls from the county commissioner, no visits from the Land Oversight Board, and certainly no apologies from anyone affiliated with the so-called development committee that had initiated the dig. Instead, his mailbox began to collect unsigned notes, small, plain slips of paper folded in half and tucked into unmarked envelopes. They carried thinly veiled messages like, "Sometimes it's better to let the process run its course," or "Interference doesn't benefit anyone." The vagueness would have sounded benign to anyone else, but to Noah, it reeked of coordination. It wasn't just silence. It was insulation. Someone wanted him to feel isolated, to begin second-guessing his instincts, to mistake their containment for his own marginalization. It worked to an extent. The lack of answers, the sudden professional distance from every agency he had tried to engage, even his lawyer's carefully neutral tone, each detail eroded something in Noah that had once felt stable. He had lived most of his adult life making decisions under pressure, allocating resources, balancing systems of control. But this wasn't a problem of logistics. It was a problem of leverage. He had none. His only weapon was information, and even that had begun to feel like contraband. His instinct was to push back, to press harder, but when he reviewed his lawyer's latest correspondence from the Department of Transportation's Office of Pipeline Safety, one paragraph stood out. The property in question is currently subject to preliminary investigative action under subsection 6.3 of the Emergency Asset Risk Review Statute, which temporarily reclassifies the location as a conditional site of interest. Any civilian-led inquiry or physical interference will be treated accordingly. They hadn't just fenced his land, they'd reclassified it. On Wednesday, as Noah returned from town with a truckload of replacement fencing materials for the north pasture, he found a car blocking his drive. Not parked at the gate, not waiting off to the side, but stationed right in the middle of the entrance, engine idling. He slowed as he approached, expecting another unmarked government vehicle, maybe a surveyor late to the scene. Instead, it was a white Lexus SUV, and stepping out from the driver's side was Karen Bates. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, the kind that belonged more at a tennis club than in a rural zone, and a light blue blouse so sharply pressed it seemed incapable of bending with her body. She was holding a large binder, already open, and waving at him before he'd even put the truck in park. Karen had been a presence on the western boundary of Noah's land for as long as he could remember. Her parcel had once been part of the same grazing land before her late husband subdivided it and built a sprawling single-story house with solar panels, stucco walls, and security cameras. She had always been polite in passing, though Noah had learned quickly that her civility was measured. She liked to know things, preferred to be consulted, and had a particular hatred for ambiguity, especially when it came from men who didn't attend community meetings. "You've caused quite the stir," she said without preamble as he rolled down the window. "I had 2 men from some energy task force knock on my door last night asking if I'd seen any unauthorized entries into your land. Told them no, of course, but it's hard not to notice federal vehicles on the ridge." Noah kept his expression neutral. He didn't want to fight, but he had little patience left for condescension. "I didn't ask for their presence," he replied. "They're here because someone approved a dig without checking what was underground. They got lucky. That pipe could have turned this whole valley into ash." Karen tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words not for truth but for relevance. "You know," she said carefully, "a lot of people around here were counting on that pond. Not just for show. There were grants involved, drought resilience proposals, even a plan to raise property values for the entire district. The perception now is that you're obstructing progress for the sake of a piece of land that hasn't been used in years." Noah didn't flinch. "It's my land," he said simply, "and I'd rather have fallow soil than a crater." Karen closed her binder slowly and placed it on the hood of her car. "I just hope you understand that making enemies here won't stop what's coming. These kinds of projects don't collapse just because someone says no, especially not someone without representation on the committee." Noah stared at her. "You're not threatening me, are you?" She offered a smile that didn't touch her eyes, just letting you know where things stand. That evening, as Noah repaired a stretch of fencing near the barn, he heard the crunch of tires again, this time slower, deliberate. A pickup truck he didn't recognize stopped near the tree line, headlights off, engine running low. 2 figures inside sat motionless. When Noah approached, the truck rolled backward out of sight without a word. No plates on the front. The rear tags were smeared in mud. Noah made note of the tire pattern. Dual rear wheel with a chipped right side tread. He wasn't paranoid. He was alert. The next morning, the gate padlock had been cut. The fence along the southern trail had been kicked in. Nothing stolen, nothing vandalized beyond necessity. Just breached, like someone wanted to make a point. Noah filed a report with the sheriff's office, but the deputy's response was lukewarm at best. "You sure it's not wildlife?" he asked, pointing to the downed fence. "Had a feral hog tear through a neighbor's pasture last week." Noah handed him a photo of the clean bolt shear on the padlock. The deputy shrugged. "Could have been kids." The slow pressure built over the next few days. His attorney warned that the county had begun reviewing historical land use patterns in the valley, including retroactive claims of easement rights under new environmental proposals. Karen began speaking at public meetings again, this time about resistant landowners who were jeopardizing regional sustainability. A public letter circulated through the local paper's opinion column, unsigned but clearly orchestrated. It accused unnamed individuals of sabotaging the long-term resilience of the water table through selfish obstruction. And yet, the federal site on Noah's land remained active. Engineers worked in silence, rarely speaking, never lingering. One afternoon, Noah overheard one of them mutter, "They really thought they'd get away with this." No one replied. Noah didn't respond to the articles, didn't challenge Karen publicly. Instead, he worked, repaired what he could, filed what needed filing, documented what he saw. But the sense of siege never left. It wasn't a matter of if there'd be another breach, it was when. They wanted to wear him down, to make him lose control, to bait him into a mistake they could frame as obstruction or aggression. He knew the game, but he wasn't playing it. Not on their terms. It wasn't until the arrival of the Environmental Field Unit that Noah truly grasped the scale of what was being unraveled beneath his feet. Unlike the previous government personnel, most of whom kept to their temporary trailer and communicated only through tightly scripted language, the field unit showed up in full force. 4 vehicles deep, with equipment trailers and a portable satellite dish that unfolded like a mechanical wing above their command station. They didn't bother knocking on Noah's door. Instead, one of the senior agents, introduced only as Meeker, approached the boundary line at the southern end of the property and called Noah over. The man was in his 40s, perhaps older, with a face that had spent more time in wind and sun than offices, and the kind of posture that only comes from having nothing to prove. "We're sealing off the site perimeter beyond what's already been cordoned," Meeker said plainly. "That means access from your lower pasture will be restricted for 72 hours while we test subsurface flow direction, density variations, and pressure ratios. You can remain in the residence, but we'll ask that you keep away from the tree line near the basin." Noah didn't ask what they were testing for. He understood. Whatever was down there wasn't just a pipe. The mere fact that they were now using atmospheric analysis sensors and seismic ground arrays indicated concern beyond structural stability. This was about potential contamination, combustion, or something far more complicated. Meeker hesitated before continuing, as if unsure whether what he was about to say was protocol or instinct. "You should know. This isn't a routine review anymore. The infrastructure we've uncovered matches an undocumented bypass configuration tied to an old military allocation file. The paperwork was never finalized, and no decommissioning report exists in federal or state records." Noah raised an eyebrow. "So what was it used for?" Meeker exhaled through his nose. "At this point, the answer is speculation. But if it was built for the military and left undocumented, there's a good chance it was part of a critical fuel redundancy grid. And if that's the case, someone recently tried to bury the evidence." That same evening, as dusk crept across the dry hills and turned the sky to ash and gold, Noah stood alone on his back deck and watched the sensors flicker in the distance. There was no sound but the occasional buzz of generators and the mechanical clicks of automated sample collectors. It would have almost looked peaceful, if not for the armed perimeter posted just beyond the barn, where 2 plainclothes agents now sat under a field tent with binoculars and encrypted radios. What disturbed him more than their presence was how seamlessly it had all happened, how easily his land had become something to be managed, a threat to be neutralized, rather than a home to be protected. The breakthrough came 2 days later, not from any agency or attorney, but from a simple email forwarded by his land use lawyer. A former intern in the county archive department had attached a scanned page from a decommissioned infrastructure register dating back to 1982. In it, a parcel map clearly highlighted Noah's property, listed under his father's name, and a handwritten annotation, MG line temp reroute. Pending removal. Await confirmation. There was no signature, no follow-up entry, just that one note. Noah's lawyer included a single sentence. We may be looking at an illegal omission from the deactivation process. Noah printed the document and placed it alongside the unsigned letter he had received earlier. He reviewed them both under lamplight, cross-referencing with the location of the dig and the statements made by the field unit. The picture began to sharpen. Someone had attempted to repurpose his land, knowing, or assuming, that whatever was buried beneath it had been forgotten. The development project, wrapped in the language of sustainability and community benefit, had never been about water or drought resilience. It had been a convenient cover for altering the terrain, perhaps even safely collapsing the pipe under layers of fill without triggering regulatory review. The only problem was that Noah had refused to sign. He drove to town the next morning and met with his lawyer in person. Together, they outlined a strategy not for exposure or litigation, at least not yet, but for preservation. They began preparing a formal request for injunctive relief, not to halt the federal investigation, but to compel the release of the names and affiliations of all third-party contractors and subcontractors who had participated in the original dig. Noah didn't need to know who was behind the cover-up. Not yet. He just needed the trail not to disappear. That same afternoon, as he returned to the ranch, a new sign had been staked into the road just beyond the federal fencing. It was sleek, made of anodized aluminum, not paper or laminated plastic like the others. It read simply, Site closed. Federal access only. Investigation active. There were no seals, no insignias, just bold, permanent lettering. Noah stepped out of his truck and stared at it for a long time. Then he walked back to the house without saying a word. By the end of the second week, the ranch no longer felt like Noah's. The house was still his, the land was still titled in his name, and the boundaries hadn't moved an inch, but the atmosphere, palpably different, had transformed the space from a refuge into a compound under siege. It was in the way the wind carried the scent of synthetic chemicals used for soil stabilization. It was in the low, constant hum of the field monitors powered by generators with no off switch. It was in the distant movement at night, figures repositioning floodlights, shifting equipment, murmuring just loud enough to register as something other than wind, but never loud enough to identify. He had learned to track them by the crunch of gravel in the dark, not because he wanted to, but because his body had adjusted, tension rewiring his sleep into hypervigilance. When he woke, it wasn't with the grogginess of fatigue, but with alertness like a switch being thrown. No ramp up, no transition. The official explanation given to his attorney had not changed. The area was under review. He was not the subject of any investigation, and his cooperation was appreciated. Yet, in the background, a second operation was unfolding, one less formal, less documented, but increasingly impossible to ignore. He noticed it first with his deliveries. Supplies he ordered from a local co-op began arriving late or not at all. When he called, the receptionist was apologetic but vague. Something about a routing change. I think we're not allowed to access your road anymore unless it's pre-cleared. That made no sense. The road was his, maintained by him. But when he pressed further, she mumbled something about a regional agreement, and then quickly moved to end the call. The next day, the feed store canceled his scheduled drop-off of winter stock for the livestock he was planning to reintroduce. They cited insurance complications due to unverified federal perimeter activity. That same afternoon, a former colleague from the export industry, someone Noah hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, called to say that someone had reached out under the pretense of conducting a background check. Said it was for an article, his friend explained. Didn't ask anything too weird. Just seemed off, like they were trying to build a profile, not tell a story. Noah didn't flinch. He took notes. Every delay, every anomaly, every shifted delivery and suspicious call. He began to categorize them not as independent events, but as parts of a system designed to wear him down. None of it was technically illegal. No threats, no violence, just erosion, enough to destabilize without drawing attention, and always accompanied by the same persistent undertone. This is too big for you. Then came the incident with the dog. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt ozone from a dry lightning storm the night before, and the ground was still crackled from lack of real rain. Noah had just finished his inspection round and was preparing coffee when he heard the barking, short, sharp bursts from the eastern perimeter. He recognized the sound immediately. It wasn't agitation, it was pain. He grabbed his boots, ran out the back door, and followed the noise until he found her. His shepherd, Scout, curled in the dirt, breathing shallow, frothing slightly at the mouth. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, just collapse. He scooped her up, raced her into the truck, and drove the 20 minutes to the nearest emergency vet. The examination was brief. The vet, a middle-aged man with a gray goatee and a calm demeanor, asked a few pointed questions, and then looked at Noah with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "If I had to guess," he said, "I'd say she ingested something. Possibly a neurotoxin or pesticide. Any chance she got into something near the construction site?" Noah's stomach dropped. He knew exactly where she'd been, the eastern ridge, just beyond the generator line. When he returned home, he scoured the area. No bait, no visible residue, but near the spot where Scout had fallen, he found something he hadn't seen before. Small, perforated packets embedded in the soil, partially buried under disturbed ground. He lifted one carefully with a gloved hand. It was coated in a clear, crystalline film. No branding, no labeling, just silence. He bagged it, labeled it, and placed it in the freezer, alongside the vet's tox screen report, which had found traces of bromethalin, a rodenticide so potent that even minimal ingestion could cause acute neurotoxicity in dogs. It wasn't the kind of chemical used accidentally. It was targeted, precise. That night, he installed motion-triggered floodlights around the barn and perimeter. Not cameras. He didn't want surveillance footage to be his only weapon. He wanted deterrence. He also had a long conversation with his attorney about whether the site could be brought under injunction based on environmental hazard. "Only if you can prove malicious intent," the lawyer said. "Otherwise, you're looking at negligence at best, and that's a legal cul-de-sac." Noah didn't need a courtroom win. He needed time, and space, and witnesses. On Thursday, a man approached the gate during daylight hours, a rare change from the usual dusk movement. He wore khakis, a polo, and the posture of someone who thought himself untouchable. He didn't introduce himself, just stood at the edge of the gate, arms folded, and called out to Noah as he approached. "You've made this a whole lot bigger than it needed to be." Noah didn't respond. The man continued. "This land isn't worth what you think it is. The pipeline's not your problem. Let the feds do their thing and go back to your life." Noah's voice was even. "It is my life. This land is my life." The man laughed. Then you're making a very poor investment. He turned and walked back to a dark sedan, climbed in and drove off, no plate, no tags. The next morning, a county inspector showed up unannounced with a clipboard and a notice of investigation into possible improper storage of hazardous materials related to solar battery units. The notice cited an anonymous complaint. NOAA showed him the power grid, fully compliant and externally audited. The inspector left without argument, but the message was received. They were pulling strings at the county level now. Then, as if coordinated, Karen Bates resurfaced, this time not in person, but as the face of a new petition posted in the local municipal building, calling for the reassessment of community impact liability for non-compliant landholders within infrastructural development zones. Her language was polished, bureaucratic, and deliberately indirect. It named no one, but everyone knew who it was about. She was not acting alone. Her involvement wasn't personal. It was strategic. She was a proxy, a polished scalpel in the hands of someone who preferred others to get blood on them. NOAA reviewed everything that night, his notes, his documents, his evidence. He didn't look for patterns. He didn't build timelines. He simply prepared, because he knew the next phase wouldn't be paperwork. It would be pressure. Real, physical, immediate pressure. And he wouldn't be caught off guard. The next move wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of another unmarked vehicle or an anonymous letter or a midnight visit from someone trying to make a point. It arrived instead as a registered letter delivered by a uniformed courier wearing the insignia of a federal agency NOAA hadn't previously encountered, something with the word strategic in it, vague enough to mean everything and nothing at once. The letter itself was clinical, written in the dry, cautious language of institutional indemnity, stating that due to the ongoing evaluation of unregistered subterranean infrastructure intersecting with national energy reserves, NOAA's property would be temporarily subject to an asset preservation order under the Emergency Containment Doctrine. The language was dense, but the message was clear. They were taking control. Temporarily, yes, but full control nonetheless. NOAA stood on his porch, the letter in one hand, his other gripping the railing so tightly the wood creaked beneath his fingers. They weren't going to wait for legal process. They weren't asking for access. They were telling him to stand aside. But NOAA wasn't going to disappear. He didn't fight them with noise or defiance. He did what most never bothered to do. He read. He read the letter twice, then 3 more times, highlighting phrases, cross-referencing federal codes, tracing the language back through statutes that had been originally drafted for national security scenarios, but had since morphed into catch-all. Tools for quiet land acquisition during infrastructural emergencies. He found loopholes, not to challenge the order but to establish boundaries. There was a clause in subsection 11, paragraph C, that specified that asset preservation was not permitted to alter structures unrelated to the targeted infrastructure without a supporting court order. That clause would become his shield. He contacted his attorney, explained what he found, and drafted an immediate cease and desist filing on any action that extended beyond the pipeline investigation area. That same day, he hand-delivered a copy of the notice to the perimeter team, who looked at him like he'd just walked into a gun range wearing a target. But they took it. And within 48 hours, a lower-ranking official with no name badge came to his porch, expression unreadable, and said only, "Understood. Your house and central structures are excluded." NOAA didn't thank him. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once and closed the door behind him. That small legal boundary became everything, because what followed wasn't procedure. It was provocation. The agents didn't cross the line, but they moved right up to it. They parked their trucks in view of his windows. They flew their surveillance drone lower, hovering above the greenhouse for no discernible reason. They installed a mobile weather station within spitting distance of his workshop and told him nothing. It wasn't surveillance. It was siege by proximity. Then came the visit. 2 men arrived just before dusk. Not agents, private suits, polished and quiet, each wearing expressions carved from stone. They waited near the front gate until Noah walked out to meet them. The taller of the two spoke. "You've been documented as cooperative, Mr. Merritt. That's good. We're here to present an opportunity to finalize this process in a manner that respects everyone's interests." Noah said nothing, waiting. The man continued. "The land you're sitting on is more valuable as a node than as a ranch. You know that now. We'd like to make an offer." He handed Noah a folder. No letterhead, no logos, just a clean documents listing an amount that made Noah's jaw clench involuntarily. It was more money than he'd seen in one place in his entire life. Enough to start over. Enough to disappear. But that wasn't the offer. That was the warning. Noah closed the folder, handed it back, and looked the man in the eyes. "This place is worth more to me as ground than as currency. You should remember that when you decide what line to cross next." The second man's mouth twitched, half amusement, half threat. But they said nothing. They turned and walked back to their black car and drove away without headlights. Later that night, Noah received an encrypted call from his attorney. The tone was different, tight, urgent. "I was contacted by someone in the Administrative Review Office. They said your site is being considered for emergency nationalization under provisional infrastructure seizure protocols. That's real. It's rare, but it's real. You need to be ready." Noah didn't ask what he meant by ready. He already knew. The next day, he called in a favor. Ed Harmon, his father's old friend and retired contractor, arrived just after noon in an aging pickup with cracked leather seats and a rolled-up blueprint under his arm. Together they walked the property, tracing the lines from memory and print, locating the pressure points, the structural overlaps, the precise orientation of the pipeline. Ed pointed to a spot near the dry creek bed. "If they try to seal this section without a proper decompression protocol, you'll get a blowout that'll crater the ridge. You'll lose every tree in 100 yards. Noah nodded, absorbing every word. He wasn't planning to sabotage. He was planning to know more than the people pretending to be in charge. That evening, as a red sun bled across the horizon, Noah stood at the edge of his barn and watched the field teams work late. He saw them arguing over a schematic, heard the sudden click of machinery failing to initialize, watched as 3 men began shouting and pointing toward the creek. Something had gone wrong. Whatever had been dormant under that soil for 40 years had teeth, and it wasn't playing nice. An hour later, a loud metallic clang rang out, followed by the unmistakable hiss of pressure escape, sharp, continuous, and far too loud to be safe. The agents froze. Lights flickered. One man dropped a tool and sprinted. A second followed. Then the generators shut down. Complete blackout. Seconds later, the emergency floodlights kicked in, but only half of them lit. Chaos. Not a drill. Not a simulation. Real, physical panic. Noah didn't move. He stood still, heart calm, pulse slow, eyes watching as the men in charge lost control of what they thought they understood. And in that moment, something shifted. The power they'd wielded over him. The silence, the threats, the surveillance. It all cracked, because now they weren't just managing him. They were managing a live threat. And the land didn't care about bureaucracy. 10 minutes later, a black SUV arrived, sirens off, engine silent. A man stepped out in full containment gear, followed by 2 others. They didn't speak. They moved with purpose, past the agents, past the engineers, straight to the breach site. Noah caught a glimpse of the equipment they carried. Manual shutoff clamps and rupture sealants. Not standard, specialized, emergency grade. When they emerged 20 minutes later, the tension had changed. Contained, but not controlled. That night, Noah received another visit. This time, it was Meeker. He stood on the porch, exhausted, jaw tight. "You were right," he said. "That line wasn't dormant. It was part of a live redundancy loop feeding auxiliary bases. Someone classified it as inactive without following protocol. They nearly cracked it open like a soda can." Noah didn't ask who. He didn't care anymore. He just looked at Meeker and asked, "Is it over?" Meeker hesitated. "Not yet. But you won't be alone from here." And that was enough, for now. The aftermath was not swift, and it was not loud. It unfolded with the slow certainty of bureaucratic fallout, layers of redacted reports, closed-door inquiries, and quiet resignations from departments that never admitted fault. Noah wasn't called to testify in court, nor was he summoned for deposition. Instead, he was visited intermittently by officials who no longer wore clipped expressions of authority, but rather carried the burden of containment. People tasked not with justice, but with cleanup. Their questions gentle, their tone cautious, as if they were speaking to someone who had seen too much to lie to. The pipeline breach was officially labeled an unauthorized infrastructural intrusion, with the accompanying language framing it as a planning failure rather than an act of malice. No arrests were made. No names were released. But contracts were voided, and the so-called development project evaporated from every official platform. One by one, the trailers disappeared, the perimeter tape was rolled back, and the land was handed back with nothing more than a dry thank you letter from a regional field office stamped with a seal that meant nothing to anyone outside of Washington. Karen Bates sold her property within 2 months. The listing was understated, the transaction private, the departure unceremonious. She left behind a manicured lawn, a stack of unopened community bulletins, and a house that no longer seemed interested in belonging to anyone. No one in town mentioned her departure directly. They just noted the quiet and moved on. Noah didn't rebuild immediately. For weeks after the final vehicle pulled out and the last generator was silenced, he kept to a quiet routine, checking the fence lines, replanting what had been torn up, patching the irrigation lines crushed under too many wheels. The land had been carved open and stitched closed, but it wasn't ruined. It was bruised, not broken. He started small, repainted the barn's interior, replaced the cracked glass on the west-facing window, began hauling scrap metal to a new pile near the shed, one piece at a time, each movement purposeful, deliberate, like resetting the bones of something long dislocated. The official compensation came later, much later. A federal grant labeled under Rural Emergency Mitigation appeared in his account without explanation, followed by an offer from a nonprofit foundation to assist in restoring heritage agricultural land affected by Federal Emergency Containment activity. Noah declined the nonprofit but accepted the grant, not because he needed the money but because accepting it meant logging the incident permanently in a federal record where no one could erase it with silence. He took that money and built something his father had once sketched out in pencil on the back of a bill of sale: a covered workshop for shared farm equipment and a solar-cooled storage facility for emergency supplies. He called it Ridge 40. No plaques, no speeches, just a place that mattered to people who'd been ignored when things went wrong. Occasionally, a car would still slow as it passed his gate. Most didn't stop. Some did. Strangers sometimes, asking for directions, or former engineers wanting to walk the land and look quietly at the place that had almost been turned to rubble. He never turned them away. He just listened, nodded, and reminded them that the story didn't belong to them anymore. On a quiet evening in early spring, as the sun slipped behind the hills and the wind carried the scent of creosote and cedar, Noah stood on his porch and looked out at the land that had once been forgotten, then claimed, then nearly destroyed. The scars were there, yes, but they were honest scars. Earned. And as he leaned on the railing, watching a fox dart across the pasture toward the far fence, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not vindication, but ownership. Not the kind printed on paper, but the kind that comes from standing your ground, not to win, but simply to remain. And that was enough.